The Yalu River. At 30,000 feet, it appeared as a glistening wound across a topography of jagged peaks and snowy valleys. Manchuria, a haven, stretched out to the north. And to the south, the harsh topography of North Korea. But high above it all, the quickest duel in human history was about to reach its crescendo. By the autumn of 1951, the skies above this corridor of land, a place the pilots had come to grimly refer to as MiG Alley, had become a deadly proving ground for a new kind of warfare. It was a warfare that would not be waged by clumsy propeller planes, but by swept-wing jets that could break the sound barrier and rip an enemy from the sky before the pilot even knew they were there. For the men of the U.S. Air Force's 4th Fighter Wing, based out of Kimpo Air Base in South Korea, every mission was a climb into the unknown. They flew the North American F-86 Sabre, a machine that was, in many ways, an extension of their own bodies. It was stable, responsive, and equipped with a radar-ranging gun sight that felt like a cheat code in the hands of a skilled pilot, but they knew their opponent. Across the Yalu, hidden in the airfields around Antung, waited the Soviet-built Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15. It was a brutish, powerful machine that could outclimb and out-accelerate the Sabre, its nose packed with a devastating mix of 23mm and 37mm cannons capable of tearing a bomber apart with a single well-placed burst. Officially, the MiGs were flown by the Communist Chinese volunteers. But every Sabre pilot who had danced with one of these adversaries at 600 miles an hour knew the truth. They weren't fighting inexperienced Chinese pilots. They were up against hardened veterans, many of whom had cut their teeth against the Luftwaffe just 6 years prior. They were facing the secret Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, a concealed army of pilots whose very existence, if exposed, threatened to ignite a Third World War. One man who knew this truth better than most was Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton. He was a cool-headed, calculating officer from Stockton, California, and he already had a place in history. Just 8 months earlier, on December 17, 1950, Hinton had led a flight of Sabres into the alley and had the distinction of becoming the first F-86 pilot to down a MiG-15 in air-to-air combat. But by June of 1951, the war had changed. The rookie MiG pilots of the winter had been replaced by men like Nikolai Sutyagin, Yevgeny Popelyev, and Lev Shchukin, Soviet aces who were rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. They didn't just dive into a furball, they waited. They watched. And they struck with surgical precision. On the morning of June 24, 1951, the air over the southern shore of the Yalu was thick with the contrails of a massive dogfight. Sabres and MiGs swirled in a deadly dance, wings glinting in the high-altitude sun. Hinton was leading his flight, hunting for a third kill to his name, when he spotted a lone Sabre in trouble. It had strayed from the pack. Suddenly, a MiG-15 dropped from the high perch above the battle, a favorite tactic of their most skilled adversary, a phantom the Americans had codenamed Casey Jones. The MiG pilot was on the Sabre's tail, and he was good. His cannons flashed, and Hinton watched in horror as heavy shells slammed into the American jet. Pieces of metal spiraled away as the F-86, engulfed in flames, began its death plunge without a second's hesitation. Hinton broke formation and pushed his Sabre to its limit, diving toward the fray. He had to save that pilot. As he closed in, the MiG driver saw him coming. The Soviet pilot broke off his attack on the burning Sabre and, in a move of astonishing audacity, pulled his nose up and around to engage Hinton in a head-on pass. The two jets screamed toward each other at closing speeds of over 1,200 miles per hour. It was a joust in the jet age. At the last possible second, the MiG flashed by, so close that Hinton could later swear they missed each other by less than 15 yards. He could probably see the paint scheme. He could probably see the whites of the other man's eyes. The fight was on. Hinton and the mysterious MiG driver twisted and turned through the sky, each trying to gain the advantage. Hinton's wingman tried to follow, but the G-forces were so extreme that he blacked out repeatedly, his G-suit struggling to keep blood in his brain. Hinton, using every ounce of his skill, managed to get a brief snapshot and fired 2 short bursts. He saw strikes on the MiG. But the enemy pilot was smart. He didn't panic. He didn't stay to fight a losing battle. Instead, he executed a perfect break, dropped his nose, and headed for the sanctuary of the Yalu at full throttle. Hinton watched him go, knowing he couldn't follow. Only after he had escorted the crippled, burning Sabre back to base did Hinton realize who he had just saved. The pilot of the stricken jet was his dear friend, Colonel Glenn T. Eagleston, the commander of the 4th Fighter Wing and a legendary ace from World War II with 18.5 kills to his name. Eagleston was a man who knew how to handle an airplane. If this MiG pilot could get the jump on someone of Eagleston's caliber, he was no amateur. Later, debriefing with his intelligence officers, Hinton couldn't shake the image of that head-on pass, the confidence of the enemy pilot. He knew exactly who he had fought. It wasn't a Chinese volunteer. It was one of Stalin's hand-picked champions. This MiG driver had been good, Hinton would later recall. Very good. He was one of the honchos, the elite Soviet aces who loitered above the battle, waiting to strike. And on that day, Bruce Hinton had come face to face with the deadliest of them all. He had just fought Nikolai Sutyagin, the man who would end the war as the top ace of the Korean conflict, with 21 American aircraft to his name. The encounter was a stark revelation. The Americans had assumed their World War II experience gave them the edge. But up here, in the thin air of MiG Alley, a new generation of aces was being forged. And they were just as skilled, just as deadly, and just as determined as the men trying to stop them. What Hinton didn't know, as he landed his Sabre back at Kimpo, was that this personal duel was just a microcosm of a much larger secret war. And on the other side of the Yalu, the man who had almost killed Eagleston was being debriefed by his own commanders, unaware that he had just crossed paths with a man who shot down the first MiG of the war. The hunters were now the hunted, and the game was far from over. While Bruce Hinton landed his Sabre at Kimpo, shaken by the sheer skill of the pilot he had just engaged, 1,000 miles away in the Kremlin, another man was watching the progress of the air war with intense personal interest. Joseph Stalin knew that the Korean conflict was, in many ways, a proxy battlefield, a place where he could bleed American resources and test his latest military technology without triggering a full-scale confrontation with the West. But the price of this proxy war was paranoia. The absolute worst-case scenario for Moscow was hard evidence that Soviet pilots, not Chinese or Korean volunteers, were pulling the triggers on American pilots. If a Soviet pilot were captured alive, or if a wrecked MiG-15 with a Russian corpse in the cockpit were to be recovered south of the front lines, it would be a political catastrophe. It could provide the ammunition that Truman's Hawks needed to expand the war, or worse, to strike back directly at the Soviet Union. This fear created a bizarre set of rules for the men of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps. When Captain Nikolai Sutyagin and his comrades from the 17th Fighter Aviation Regiment took off from their base at Antung, across the river in Manchuria, they were flying under a cloak of deception so thick it bordered on the absurd. Their MiG-15s were painted with North Korean or Chinese insignia. They were issued phrase books with basic Korean and Chinese commands, and were under strict orders to speak only those languages over the radio during a fight, even if it meant shouting mangled phrases in the heat of a dogfight while pulling 6GS. They were forbidden to fly over the Yellow Sea or deep into South Korean territory, lest they be forced to ditch and be captured. Their primary mission wasn't just to shoot down Sabres, it was to do so without leaving a trace of their true identity. For a man like Sutyagin, a 28-year-old from a small village near Nizhny Novgorod who had missed the great air battles of World War II while stationed in the Far East, these restrictions were a cage. He was a natural predator, a pilot with a kind of eyesight that could spot a speck on the horizon long before his comrades, and the kind of patience that allowed him to wait in the thin, cold air at 45,000 feet, watching the swirling dogfights below like an eagle eyeing a field of rabbits. By the summer of 1951, he had perfected the tactic the Americans had codenamed Casey Jones, the high perch. He wouldn't dive into the furball with the rest of his squadron. He would loiter above, pick out an isolated Sabre, and then convert his altitude into an unholy amount of speed in a diving pass, blasting the enemy jet with his cannon before zooming back up to the safety of the clouds. But on June 24, after the head-on pass with Hinton, Sutyagin returned to Antung with a new understanding. The American he had faced was no novice. The two men had looked at each other through inches of plexiglass, and for a split second, it was no longer a proxy war. It was personal. It was a duel between two masters of a brutal new craft, and neither man would forget the other. While these duels played out in the heavens, the American intelligence community was scrambling to confirm what men like Hinton already suspected. The radio chatter they intercepted was a dead giveaway. They'd hear Russian cursing over the radio when a pilot was in trouble, one intelligence officer later noted. But proving it was another matter. The MiGs were untouchable in their sanctuaries north of the Yalu. The U.S. had a standing order. Under no circumstances were Sabres to pursue an enemy across the river into Manchuria. To do so would be an act of war against China, and potentially, by extension, the Soviet Union. The pilots called it MiG Alley, because it was a stretch of sky where they could fight, but just beyond an invisible line, the enemy was safe. He could climb, reset, and come at them again. It was like fighting a boxer who could step out of the ring to rest between rounds. Meanwhile, back at Kimpo, the mood in the 4th Fighter Wing's Officers Club was somber. Colonel Eagleston, the man Hinton had saved, was grounded, his Sabre a wreck. The intelligence officers debriefing Hinton pressed him for details. Describe the pilot's maneuvers, they asked. Was he aggressive? Did he fly like a Russian or a Chinese? Hinton could only tell them what he already knew in his gut. This MiG driver had been good, very good. He described the Casey Jones tactic, the high perch, the surgical strike. The intel officers nodded. They had a name for that tactic now, and a growing file on the men who used it. But until they could get one of those MiGs, or one of those pilots, they were fighting a ghost. The war ground on through 1952 and into 1953, the aerial duels over MiG Alley becoming a brutal routine. Every morning, young men on both sides climbed into their cockpits, knowing the statistics. If you were shot down over enemy territory, your chances of survival, let alone rescue, were slim. The Yalu remained that invisible, inviolable line. A Sabre pilot who strayed across it was on his own, a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. A MiG pilot who fell south of the river faced a future in a prison camp, his true identity a secret his own government would deny to the death. For Bruce Hinton, the war continued without another head-on clash with his phantom adversary. He finished his tour, rotated home, and was awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day in June, for saving Eagleston. But he never forgot the sight of that MiG filling his windscreen, the skill of the pilot who had met him head-on and then vanished like a ghost. He would carry that memory with him for the rest of his life. And what of Nikolai Sutyagin?
He didn't stop. He couldn't stop.
The Casey Jones of MiG Alley continued his deadly high-perch tactics, refining them with each mission. He developed a simple but devastatingly effective formula, one he had learned from studying the great Soviet aces of World War II: use your altitude to gain speed, close to an almost suicidal range, 200 meters, sometimes less, and fire only when you couldn't miss. While American pilots were trained to fire from 800 meters, Sutyagin would wait until the Sabre filled his entire gun sight. He knew that at that range, his 37mm cannon shells would punch through the American jet like a fist through paper. By the time the armistice talks began in earnest in 1953, Sutyagin's score had climbed to an astonishing 21 confirmed victories, making him the top ace of the entire Korean War. Every single one of his kills was an F-86 Sabre, the finest jet fighter the United States had to offer, flown by the best pilots in the American inventory. He had become a living legend within the secret Soviet fraternity, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in the briefing rooms at Antung. He had faced the best the Americans could send, and he had beaten them, time and time again. But here's the twist in this story, the part that neither Hinton nor Sutyagin could have known as they circled each other in the cold Korean sky. For all the intensity of their personal duel, for all the secrecy and the propaganda and the kill counts, the war in the air ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. On July 27, 1953, the armistice was signed.
The guns fell silent.
The Yalu River, that deadly border, became just a river again. When the history books were written, both sides claimed victory. The Americans pointed to their superior kill ratios, the skill of pilots like Joseph McConnell Jr., who would end the war with 16 victories, becoming America's triple ace. The Soviets pointed to men like Sutyagin, who had proven that their aircraft and their pilots could match, and in some ways surpass, the best of the West. The truth, as it always does, lay somewhere in the gray mist between the two claims. But here is where the story takes its final, unexpected turn. A turn towards something that feels, against all odds, like a happy ending.
Decades passed. The Cold War thawed, then ended.
The Soviet Union crumbled, and its secrets began to spill out into the open. In the 1990s, historians and researchers gained access to long-classified Soviet archives. The truth about the Chinese volunteers was finally, officially confirmed. The world learned the names of the Soviet aces who had fought and died in the secret war over Korea: Sutyagin, Popeliev, Kromerenko, and dozens of others. In the United States, a group of aging veterans, men like Bruce Hinton, watched these revelations with a mix of vindication and curiosity. They had known all along. They had fought these men. They had cursed them in the heat of battle, called them honchos, respected their skill, and feared their tactics. And then, something remarkable happened. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as relations between the United States and Russia tentatively improved, some of these former enemies began to reach out to one another. They met at air shows, at museums, at reunions.
They shook hands.
They shared stories. They looked into the eyes of the men they had once tried to kill. For Bruce Hinton, the opportunity to finally meet his adversary never came. Nikolai Sutyagin had passed away in 1986, a decorated colonel, a hero of the Soviet Union, but a man whose greatest achievements had been hidden from the world for decades. Hinton never got to shake his hand, never got to buy him a drink and ask him, "What were you thinking in that head-on pass?" But other meetings did happen. American and Soviet aces sat down together, translators struggling to keep up as the pilots used their hands to trace the loops and rolls of long-ago dogfights. They discovered that they were, in so many ways, the same. They had shared the same sky, the same fears, the same exhilaration. They had been pawns in a much larger game, young men sent to fight a proxy war for leaders who would never know their names. And in those meetings, something profound occurred. The hatred, the propaganda, the us versus them, it all melted away. What remained was a bond that only those who have faced death at 40,000 feet can understand. A bond of mutual respect, of shared experience, of having been there. One former Soviet pilot, when asked what he thought of the Americans he had fought, put it simply, they were very good pilots.
We respected them.
It was an honor to fight against such men. When asked the same question, an American ace replied, "I'm just glad we're on the same side now."
The Sabre and the MiG. the hunter and the hunted.
In the end, they became something far more important. Brothers of the sky, bound together by a war that, for all its fury and fear, could not extinguish the fundamental humanity of the men who fought it. The sun sets over the Yalu River now, the water glinting peacefully below.
The contrails are gone.
The roar of jet engines has faded into history. But if you listen closely in the quiet moments, you can still hear them, the ghosts of MiG Alley, the young men who climbed into their cockpits and wrote their names in the sky. They came from different worlds, spoke different languages, served different flags. But for one brief, blazing moment, they met in the thin air above a forgotten peninsula, and they became legends. And in the end, isn't that enough? Isn't that the happy ending, that they survived, that they remembered, and that in the twilight of their lives, they found peace with the ghosts they once chased?
The war is over. The pilots have gone home.
And MiG Alley, at last, is silent.